Oh, hey, como vai? Hey, it's Bill Jelen from Mr. Excel. It's great to be back here for Excel Weekend, if only virtually. Today, we're going to be talking about VBA with pivot tables. Now, hey, look, I know that this book, Microsoft Excel VBA Macros, has been translated to Portuguese. Cristiano was the translator and is for sale in Brazil. This book, I don't think so. Microsoft Excel Pivot Table Data Crunching. Today's VBA code comes from both books. Both talk about this, although I think the data sets are actually from the book on the right. The plan today, I'm going to talk about 7 different things. First, we're going to build our first pivot table using VBA, changing all calculations from sum to average, a top 10 report with the correct grand total, calculated fields, which I love, calculated items, I hate, but I'll show you the workaround, grouping daily dates to weeks, months, quarters, or years, and then replicating a pivot table for each item along a dimension. Now, the VBA code that I'm using today, you can download that. I don't go through and explain every bit, but hopefully you'll be able to get an idea of how powerful VBA can be. And even if you never plan on using VBA, you'll learn a couple of pivot table tricks along the way here. Let's go. In our first example, we're going to take a look at the VBA to build a basic pivot table, how to create the pivot cache, generate the pivot table from the pivot cache, and then add fields. Once you have those basics, then everything else becomes very, very simple. Also here, remove grand totals, repeat all item labels, how to turn that on, and then how to change the code to create a completely different pivot table. Let's get started. Well, let's take a look at the VBA needed to create a simple pivot table. And the pivot table I'm trying to create today, we'll do insert pivot table. Here in an existing worksheet, cell J2, click OK. I'll put region and customer down the left-hand side, products going across the top, and revenue in the heart of the pivot table. All right. Now, you'll notice that because of my pivot table defaults, that's under File, Options, Data, it's already in this tabular form instead of compact form. I already have repeat all item labels turned on. But the VBA that we use doesn't rely on your pivot table defaults. So, we're going to get a slightly different pivot table when we do this with VBA. I'm going to switch over to the VBA editor. I have a little macro here called create pivot. I define some variables up front, one for a pivot cache. When you click on a cell in the data and do insert pivot table, that data is loaded into a pivot table cache, and then an object variable hold the pivot table. Also, an object variable, we don't really need this one to hold the range where the data is. Okay, so first thing I want to do is I want to delete any existing pivot tables. So for each PT, that's a variable in this worksheet, pivot tables, we do pt.tablerange2.clear. Table range 2 is the entire pivot table. So we just loop in case there were any pivot tables here, we get rid of them. And then I want to figure out how many rows and columns of data we have today. So starting from the last row in this worksheet, pressing Control End, or in the old days, the End key and the up arrow key will tell us what row is the last row with data, what column is the last column with data using XL to left. And then we define a range starting from cell A1, so cells 11.resize, final row and final column. So that defines essentially this area here. Control asterisk selects the current region. We're essentially doing that. And then I create the pivot table cache. So we're going to add a new pivot table cache. The source type is a database. Source data is prange.address. And then finally here, we actually create the pivot table. This is where we give it a destination. So it's going to go to row 2 and 2 columns after the last data. So it'll show up in J2. And we give it a name, pivot table 1. All right. So that just, at that point, all we have is a blank pivot table. We'll stop right there and run up to that point. So you can see the blank pivot table appears. And now we're about to add fields. So for the row fields down the left-hand side, we're going to put region and customer, and we pass those as an array. For the column field, we put product. So there's our region and customer and product. And then our value field. In the old days, it was called a data field. So we're taking that revenue field, setting the orientation to be XL data field. The function is sum. It's the first one. We even get to specify the number format, which is nice. In a regular pivot table, the number format has to be done after the fact. And then give it a name. So we'll run these. And then refresh the pivot table. It's funny because I'm stepping through the code. We actually get to see the results. But if we just ran this, this would remain an empty pivot table until we did refresh the table. All right, so there we go. There's our pivot table, very similar to what we had before. You'll notice here that I still have to turn on repeat all item labels. The number formats are already there. So we're down here. We're going to add stripes. We're going to set the pivot table style to pivot style medium 10. And then watch this, we're going to get rid of the column grand, Now to me, in English we call this the grand total column, but that's not what column grand is talking about. Column grand is talking about the grand total at the bottom of each column. So this line right here, we'll set that to false. That goes away. The row grand is the grand total at the end of each row. Set that to false. That goes away. And then to fill in these blanks here with the value from above, that's called repeat all labels. That gets filled in. And then I'm going to get rid of these subtotals here. And first I turn them on, and then I turn them off. And we're good to go. At this point, I just want to make sure that I end up back on the sheet, which of course I will, and select the first cell in the pivot table like that. All right, so that's the very basic code to create a pivot table. Now let's try and change this a little bit. Let's say that instead of region and customer, we want to show maybe date down the left-hand side. So we come back to our pivot table. Right here where we were specifying region and customer before, we'll say date. Notice that it no longer has to be an array, but I'm going to leave it as an array. And then instead of product across the top, we'll put region. And we'll just run this code. All right, and so very quickly, now we have dates down the left-hand side, regions going across the top. Once you have this basic macro to create a pivot table, the only things you really need to edit from here on out are which fields you want in the row area, which fields in the column area, and then which fields in the data area. I love this next example. It was a question that came in recently. The poor guy had 100 fields in the value area, and he needed to change them all from sum to average. And that's a huge manual process, but very easy in VBA. Let's take a look. Okay, so in the first example, we were just using VBA to create pivot tables that we could create easily using the user interface. This question came in, and this is one where VBA is so much faster than the alternative. The person who sent the question in had a pivot table with 150 different fields in the values area. Right now, my data set only has about 75, but they said that frequently they had to change the pivot table to change from sum to average. And that was a tremendous amount of manual effort. So if we go there to the sum of Alabama, double click, and then change to average and click OK, and then you're doing that for every single field all the way across. Let's take a look at this code, which is remarkably simple, right? So we dimension PT as an object variable pointing to the pivot table, and then PF as a pivot field. We're going to loop through each pivot table in the active sheet. In this case, there's only one. And then for each pivot field in the pivot table data fields, we're going to change the function of that pivot field to XL average, and then next, and then refresh the table. So just watch how fast this is. So we just successfully changed everything to average back here. To go back to sum, it's the exact same code, just changing to XL sum. And of course, very similar code to change to max or to min. This was certainly a case where it was much easier to use VBA than the manual labor-intensive method of double-clicking on each heading, changing the calculation, and then going on to the next one. The next example is the top 10 filter. We're going to copy that report with the subtotal to a new sheet and then change the underlying pivot table to get rid of the filter and get the true grand total. So we have the best of both worlds, the total of the top 5 and the total of everything. Here we go. All right, the next thing I want to take a look at is using the top 10 report. And we'll create a little pivot table here, just manually insert pivot table, an existing worksheet here, click OK. We'll put customers down the left-hand side, revenue in the heart of the pivot table, and number format, let's go with currency and 0 decimal places. Okay, so there's a couple things we can do. First off, we can sort the customers high to low. You can come in here and more sort of options, but it's also possible just to come here and data Z to A, right? And then they have something called the top 10 filter, value filters, top 10. And it doesn't have to be 10, it can be 5 or anything like that. So I'm going to change this to the top 5 items. And before I click OK, I just want to point out that our grand total here is 71 million. But after using the auto filter, the grand total is 34 million. And of course, the way to fix this on the design tab, subtotals, include filtered items and totals, is grayed out. Right? And this report would always get me in trouble, right? Because I would show the top 5 customers and then the grand total, that's not the grand total, that's the total of just those 5. What my manager and his manager really wanted to see was the grand total of everyone. They want to be back at that $70 million number. All right, so that's one of the downsides of pivot tables and using that top 10 filter. But I have a great little macro back here that will get around that problem. All right, so the top 5 customers, and this macro is very similar to the other macro right down to this point here where we've created the report with customers down the left-hand side, products across the top, revenue in the values area. One thing that it does here is it changes the setting in pivot table options that if the cell is empty, it usually shows blank, and now it shows a 0 in there. It kind of freaks me out that it's a text 0, but you have to put a text 0 there, and an actual 0 gets entered in the pivot table. All right, and then here, this so we go to the pivot table.pivot fields customer, auto sort, descending, based on the total revenue field. That's the name that we used right there. That'll get our data high to low, and then the top 10 filter. Using the customers, we auto show. The range is XL top, the count is 5, and that field is based on total revenue, and then refresh the pivot table. So at this point, we then have a pivot table showing the top 5 customers. From here, I'll actually create a brand new workbook with a single worksheet, this XL WBAT worksheet. That's a great constant that's used to create a single sheet. We'll define a object variable to that sheet. So it's just the first worksheet in WBN, the new workbook. This is the report workbook. We'll call it report. Add a little heading there. And then this is a great little feature here. So in the pivot table, we use table range 2. And we want to get rid of the top row in the pivot table. So we offset by 1 row, copy that whole thing, and then paste special values and formats to the report sheet. Figure out where the last row is, right? And then watch this great little trick here. We'll put a couple of breakpoints in. It goes back to the original pivot table, removes customer, which removes the top 10 filter, and then grabs those grand totals and copies it to the report. Clears out our pivot table and then does a little bit of formatting here. So let's figure out a good place to do some breakpoints. We'll put a breakpoint right there, and then we'll take a look at this code as it walks through. All right, so just seeing this side by side, we'll come here, run this code. All right, so at that point, we've now created a report of the top 5 customers. That grand total, in my opinion, is wrong. It's not the grand total that I want to show. we add a new workbook and copy that data over. I'll run down to the next breakpoint. See, so we now have our report of the top 5. And now we're back. Now we're going back to the original pivot table. Let's take a look at that. And we now have the grand total for each product, irrespective of the filter. Press F8, copy and paste. At this point, we can clear out the pivot table, clear out the cache, and then do a little bit of formatting here. And finally, a message box that the CEO report has been created. So now check this out. What we have is the top 5 total in row 9, which is the total of just those 5 items. If I look down here at the sum, 5823, yep, good. But then by going back to the pivot table, refreshing it without customer, and then getting those grand totals, we make everybody happy. It's the report of just the top 5, and then the report of the grand total, including things beyond the top 5. This is one that always frustrated me. I was always creating the pivot table twice and copying and pasting them, and now with VBA handling that for me, a much easier way to go. Calculated fields in a pivot table are great. They're good for adding a new calculation. Here I'm going to show you how to create profit divided by revenue, both in a regular pivot table and using VBA. Okay, let's dive even further into obscure pivot table features, this time creating a calculated field. So we insert a pivot table here in an existing worksheet, click OK. Anything down the left-hand side, customer, and then revenue and profit. So I'd like to create a new field here called gross profit percent, which is profit divided by revenue. So from this cell, fields, items, and sets, a calculated field. And it always starts out with that formula of equals 0, and I want to do a formula of equal profit divided by revenue. Click OK. And change the heading and the number format there, and we're good to go. Let's take a look at how to do that. So the start of the macro is just like everything else. We put product down the side, and then the column fields are something called data. That's basically saying that we're taking the values and moving it across the columns. And then right here, actually before we even move anything into the pivot table, we're creating a new calculated field. So pt.calculatedfields.add. The name is going to be called profit percent. There can't be any spaces in there. The formula is equal profit divided by revenue. Right? And then we add revenue as the first data field, profit as the second data field, format those with a comma, and then finally profit percent as the third data field, formatted as a percentage, and then change the name to GP percent. Make sure that if there's any empty cells, we get a 0, and then refresh the pivot table. So we'll watch this one run very fast. And we get revenue, profit, and gross profit percent, all with the correct formatting. Well, calculated fields are great. Calculated items are a completely different thing. It always makes my grand totals wrong, but I'm going to show you a little macro that will remove the component items, and those grand totals will be right again. Let's take a look. All right, so we just did calculated fields. How about calculated items? I'm not a fan of calculated items because I think that they create a problem with the grand totals. A bit of a simple little report here with product down the left-hand side and revenue. And you'll notice that we have $71 million worth of revenue. So it's possible to create a calculated item that would add maybe 2 of these up or something like that. Fields, items, and sets, calculated item. We can call this my division is equal to A292 plus B722. All right, but just notice here, we have $71 million, and as soon as I create this new division, my totals are wrong. I went from 71 million to 96 million. Of course, we can take this item and move it. But the real thing that you would have to do in order to get that 71 million back is you would have to come in and remove A292 and B722. So we can combine those 2 products into one item, but the only way to get the grand total to be correct is to remove the items that flow into that. All right, so let's take a look at how we would do that. So calc items fixed. We set up the pivot table with product down the row fields. And then right here, to create a new calculated item as pt.pivotfields along the product dimension, we're adding a calculated item.add. We're calling it my division, which is A292 plus C409. Notice we have to put apostrophes in there. Boy, and that really looks confusing. That's an apostrophe and then a double quote. We move A292 to be first, C409 to be second, my division to be third. And then down here, change the visibility of those two pivot items to be false. So let's take a look at running right up to this point. All right, so you can see we have the report with the wrong total, and then we get rid of the visibility of those two items, and now the grand total is back to the correct number. The other thing I'm doing all the time is grouping dates, taking those daily dates up to months, quarters, and years. It's kind of tricky. It's 7 true-false values. You have to remember seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, and years. And as a bonus here, how to group by week, which isn't even in the dialog box. Here we go. All right, our next topic is grouping these daily dates up to months, quarters, and years. Take a look at how that would work in the user interface. Dates down the left-hand side and revenue. Okay, now we have to either do this from the date heading or from one of the dates. We go into a group field. And this is really important here to look at these choices. There's 7 choices here in a specific sequence: seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, and years. And you have to remember that sequence. My goal is to group this up to months, quarters, and years. And so that's the first, second, third, fourth, the 5th, 6th, and 7th items in this list. And we're going to have to remember that for the VBA. So report by month, we come down here, everything is the same. We put dates along the row fields. The column fields is region. Add the revenue in as a data field. Make sure that the blanks are showing up as zeros. Draw the pivot table. And right here, this is the group action. So along the date field, dot label range dot group, the periods are going to correspond to seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, and years. All right, and you just have to pass those in that exact sequence, and then we'll refresh the pivot table. So let's take a look at it just before we do the group. You see that we have daily dates going down the left-hand side, and then I'll press F8 to group, and we now have years, quarters, and months like that. An obscure thing that most people don't know is available is if you needed a group by week. So let's take these fields and we'll ungroup them. Come in to the date field and go to group field, choose just days. And when you choose only days, this spin button becomes available and you can roll that up to 7-day periods like that. So to do that in VBA, there's a little bit of extra code here to figure out the first date and then roll that back to the first Monday, right? And then here, where we're doing the label range dot group, so that's seconds, minutes, hours, days. Days is the only thing that's true. Months, quarters, and years is false. And then the by argument is rolling up to 7-day periods. We're also setting the start to be equal to that Monday that we calculated. That way, each row will run Monday through Sunday. We'll run this one. And you see that we now end up with weekly periods running Monday through Sunday, rolled up like that. All right, my last trick from Sylvia Juhasz of Excel.tv, replicating a single pivot table for each item. So for each product, for each customer, great use of the dot show pages in VBA. All right, I want to finish up here with one of my favorite features. I learned this from Sylvia Juhasz, who you might have seen on Excel.tv. And it's the quick way to replicate a pivot table for every product or customer or whatever. So let's just do this here in the user interface, and then we'll take a look at the code. So we're going to build a report with dates going across, and we're going to roll those daily dates up to years. Down the left-hand side, customer, revenue here. And then we're going to use a field that we haven't used before, the filters field. All right. So now that we have this report looking like we want it to look, I'm going to take this report and I'm going to create it for each of the 5 products. That option here is very hidden under Pivot Table Analyze, not the Options button, but the tiny little drop down called Show Report Filter Pages, Show All Pages of Product. And you see it just inserted 5 new sheets, one for each of our products, like that. Although that's hidden in the user interface, it's actually very easy to do in VBA. Let's take a look at that code. So here, the customer by product report. We come down here, set up the row fields with date going across in the column fields, customer going down the side, product in filter area, which used to be called page fields. And then we are getting the number of orders here in the data area. Draw the pivot table, group that up to years. Remember, seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, years. So we roll it up to years. Add revenue in, revenue as a percentage of total, right? Changing the calculation to XL percentage of column. Sort by customer. Do a little bit of formatting. Refresh the pivot table. And then right here, this pt.showPages is the equivalent to going into Show Report Filter Pages. And it says, show all pages of what, and we say product. And then just a little bit of code here that loops through all the worksheets in the workbook, looking for the word product up in cell A1. If it finds it, then it knows that it's one of these sheets and does a little bit of formatting. All right, so we'll run this code. Okay, so what we get is 5 new worksheets, one for each product, a little bit of formatting, some things that wouldn't be possible in the pivot table, such as deleting the extra columns. All thanks to Show Report Filter Pages. Okay, well, that's the end of my time. Wrap up building your first pivot table in VBA. That code is then used in all of the subsequent code, changing all calculations from sum to average or back to sum, top 10 report with the correct grand total, calculated fields. Watch out for those calculated items. The totals are always wrong. Grouping daily dates to weeks, months, quarters, years, even weeks. Grouping daily dates to months, quarters, years, even weeks, and then finally replicating a pivot table for each item along a dimension. Again, I'm Bill Jelen. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my session today.